Ladies and gentlemen, friends of ITU, ladies and gentlemen online, thanks for being here for our first lecture. Today, under the title, Understanding Systems and Societies Through Interdisciplinarity. I'm very glad and happy that we today will introduce to you two additional professors of ITU, and specifically two people who want to help us to understand the modern world. The modern world is a little bit difficult to understand because a lot happens invisibly in the virtual world, in networks, which you don't really see. And we don't have the opportunity to really understand or see these systems, which are behind a lot of what's happening nowadays. And both Bernd and Tiago have basically set out in their research to make all these kind of hidden connections, these hidden rules, systems visible, and if possible, to understand them, and maybe also to come up with ideas on how to improve them or to influence them to a positive effect over time. Yeah, and with this, I already want to introduce Tiago Peixoto with the topic of the hidden simplicity of complex systems. And Tiago has had a very long way to come here to Austria, to ITU, because he started his journey, his academic journey in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And this is where he did his master's and PhD in physics. So he's very heavily grounded in physics and theoretical physics and modeling, and then developed over time through the Technical University in Darmstadt and then also the University in Bremen to statistics, computer science, and then going to the University of Bath. And his last position before coming to ITU was the Central European University. And in this time, he developed a software framework for analytics on graphs, on networks, which is very, very impressive and is used by over 100 universities worldwide today. And yeah, and we are very happy that we have him here now as one of our very first founding professors. And with this, I would like you to take the stage.
Thank you, Stephanie. So indeed, I will talk about what I work with, which is complex systems and network science. So let me give you a few examples. So one of the simplest, more interesting examples of this is the behavior of animals, like birds, for example, or fish. This is, you probably have seen this. So this is called the murmuration of starlings. So starlings are these little birds, and they move around doing this flocking behavior, right? Which is very puzzling the first time you see it. In fact, originally, when people started looking at this and observing it, there were even theories that, how could they possibly be doing this? How they're communicating with each other? How they're synchronizing in this way? Maybe they even have telepathy or something, right? So this is, you can watch it for hours. It looks indeed quite interesting, right? So how could this be? How do they figure out where they should go, these little birds? It turns out they're not that smart. This also is seen in fishes and many other kinds of animals, and we can explain pretty much what's going on with relatively simple rules. So this is a simulation which I'm about to show you. This is a model for fish, but it applies equally well to birds as well. So there are three rules here in the simulation. So these are the little fishes, and they move, right, in some direction. And when they come too close, they repel each other because they want to hit, okay? And they also try to align their heading. So if they see some people close to them, some other fish close to them, if they're going in some direction, they go in the same direction. And they also try to move toward the center. So if there's a bunch of fish over there, they also want to go over there. So these are the three rules. So if you just run these rules, then you start seeing some organized behavior, right? It's kind of interesting because these fish are also blind, so they don't see in front of them, so they cannot see, but still they move along the line, right? So this is literally what they cannot see. So we can explain this collective behavior just with relatively simple rules. So they don't have to be trying to do that. Here's another example. So this is lime mold, right? So this is a unicellular organism or acellular organism. And it grows its filaments. So if you put it around, it starts growing these filaments. So what you're showing here is the following. It's a maze. And here are two food sources. And then they put these lime molds. And then over time, this is sped up, right? It's a bit slow, but this is sped up. And then over time, the filaments, they grew. You can see them here. And this lime mold found the solution to the maze. So it connected the two food sources through the shortest path. This thing doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have a single neuron. But it still grew around the maze. Here's a similar example. So they put a bit of slime mold here. And these other dots are food sources. And they're meant to mimic the geography of Japan. So this is Tokyo, and these are the other cities around. And they let it grow. And after some time, it formed these filaments. And they compare with the actual roads. It matched pretty well. So what the slime mold found was matched pretty much the actual roads that humans found, right? This doesn't have a single neuron. Again, we can explain this relatively simple rules. So here's a simulation of a possible slime mold that I'm showing you here. And there are three rules at play here. So we have the cytoplasmic filaments, and when they move, they leave a trail, right? And then they move in random direction. They can go in the same direction, or with some probability they can go in either direction at random. However, if nearby there is another trail, this increases the probability that it goes in that direction. So it likes to go where other parts of it has gone before. So that's all. And then if you run this, as you can see here, after some time you start seeing these trails and these nodules, and the trails they tend to follow the shortest path between the nodules. So just this this process of accumulation here, this reinforcement process, is enough to reproduce this behavior. Again, so this thing is not that smart. It's just that this mechanism by itself tends to solve this problem. Here's another interesting example. These are two seemingly very different situations. So this is a very low resolution video, but I hope you can see these flashes. What these flashes are, these are fireflies, right? And if you take these insects and you put them in isolation, they flash with some periodic frequency. And if you put two of them, they fire in an unsynchronized way. But if you put many of them, they start flashing together like this, right? And again, you can ask the same question: why are they doing this? How are they doing this? Are they pay attention to all of them and try? Maybe there's a mechanism where they try to flash together. Here's another example, and this is from the year 2000, a quarter of a century ago. They built this Millennium Bridge in London. So this was the opening day of this bridge. And people were just starting to go there. This was a new attraction. As you can see, what's happening in the video is that people are moving in lockstep. They're doing exactly the same motion. And this is rocking the bridge. And they actually had to stop it because this could destroy the bridge. It could enter in resonance with the bridge. And this was a dangerous situation, not by design. not by design by the architects, but also not by the people. They're not trying. If you are in the army and you march, yes, you're trying to be synchronized, but this is not, these are just regular people, but they just happen to end up synchronizing, right? So what's happening? There's a phenomenon called the spontaneous synchronization. Indeed, as you might expect at this point, there's also a simple mechanism that we can use to explain this. So this is a very simple, like a toy model that explains this, called the Kuramoto model. And what you see here is the many oscillators, and they all have their own frequency. So each color here has a different frequency. As you can see, they're going different speeds. So this is unsynchronized motion. And this is governed by a very simple equation here. And there's one parameter, the parameter k, which is the coupling between them. So if this coupling is positive, it means that they'll tend to go a little bit with the rest of the population. And if increases a little bit, if increases coupling strength a little bit, like this, nothing happens. Okay, so now they're kind of they tend to be a little bit in sync, but nothing really changing. But then if you go beyond the magical value, just a little bit beyond it, this happens. Now they're synchronizing. There's a phase difference, but they are going with the same frequency. So just a small coupling between them above a critical point makes them all synchronized. And this is what's happening with the fireflies and also with the people, right? So what happens at the bridge works as this coupling. So you go a little bit, everybody goes a little bit in one direction, so the bridge goes a little bit in one direction. This causes everybody to compensate to the other side, and so on. And this coupling between them causes the whole thing to synchronize. Right? So it's not desired, it's not something that's conscious or engineered. It just happens. So these are 3 examples of complex systems. So what is a complex system then? Okay, so there are 3 ingredients, I would say. First of all, there needs to be many elements that interact, and they interact locally. Okay, they just see part of the system. The local rules are simple. There's something we can describe with a simple mathematical equation or a simple algorithm. But if you combine these 2 things, then there's an emergent microscopic behavior, a self-organization, which is not immediately trivial. And what's important here in this definition is that complex doesn't mean complicated, right? It's just that the simplicity is hidden. You don't see it immediately, right? But this is a bit of a problem with this terminology when complexity scientists are talking about. They're talking about simple systems in reality. And one thing I find particularly fascinating in this field is how it gives you immediately a huge breadth of interdisciplinarity, right? We end up seeing these systems in many branches of science, right? In many domains of the scientific inquiry. And I think the best example I think of is this one here. It's called percolation. This is something that physicists have studied for decades. It's a very old problem, and it has to do with porous material, right? Sounds very boring, but it's like coffee. Think of coffee. So you want to understand, what happens, how hard should you press your espresso cup so that your espresso ground such that it flows, so that coffee flows, right? So this is an example, a little model of coffee. So these are the grounds here, and this is the space between them. If you make the porosity very small, which means you press your coffee very strongly before you make the espresso, then you try to make the espresso, the water doesn't flow, right? You failed. You don't have an espresso. If you make this, if you don't press too much and there's more porosity, then finally, if you run the water, it flows through and you have coffee, right? I think my colleague Daniel, who's a hydrologist, likes this example very much. I'm sure he's very excited about. And then there is and it's interesting because a kind of a phase transition, right? There's this magical value, which is this one here. So if you run at this point, this is called the percolating, this transition. At this point, it starts to percolate, only at this point, right? So essentially, below this point, nothing happens. And above this, you start to percolate, right? So there is a phase transition. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Well, if you replace the word water by disease and the porosity by vaccination, or lack thereof, then this curve describes a pandemic. It's exactly the same model, right? In fact, this critical value of the porosity here, this parameter is called the R0, or the basic reproduction number. I'm sure all of you heard during COVID. Everybody was saying, this has to be below 1, because if it's below 1, you're here. And there is no transmission of the disease. If it's here, it becomes a huge pandemic. So by solving how water flows to porous material, to rock, through coffee, we have understood something about how diseases spread as well. And this is a phenomenon called universality, where we see the same thing happening. So nature, as I say it often, doesn't respect these boundaries that we put in academia and in science, right? It doesn't care. So there's one difference, though, between the coffee and the disease, is that the disease doesn't navigate through this 2D lattice. Instead, it navigates through a more complex network like this, right? This is a network of airports, right? So the disease transmits over this more complex topology. And this is actually what I work with. I work on network systems, on network science. I try to explain complex systems that have as its structure, as its backbone, a network of interactions. So there's elements and connections between them. So global transportation is a clear example. You have also online social networks, right? So this spread now of not of a disease, but maybe of a misinformation or a meme follows similar rules. The human brain is also a network. Food webs, right? Which species consume other species. The internet, interactions between proteins. Okay, these are all complex systems that are modeled through networks, right? I'm interested in this kind of system. So what I want to do is understand the minimal rules that explain behavior on this system. I'm interested in the so-called inverse problem. I showed you some examples of what a complex system is, and I told you what the rules are, but how do you find them, right? How do you find the minimal rules? So a good, maybe a little illustration would be something like this. Suppose this is your data, okay? You're observing your system, and it's doing something that seems crazy, right? Maybe it's a little bee that's moving around, and you want to model this. And if you stare at it long enough, maybe you'll notice some regularities. For example, it's kind of strange that it doesn't move away from this box. It kind of goes to the center a little bit. If you wait long enough, at some point, it's going to go to the center. But other than that, I don't know what it's doing. So the task is to come up with a methodology, a way of understanding what is the minimal rule here. And then we should, of course, come up with different hypotheses and have a way of measuring how well we are doing in terms of describing this in the most parsimonious way possible. And if you succeed, you can uncover the minimal rule, which in this case is this little pendulum, right? So pretty simple. So a very simple system gives us very complex behavior. In fact, these are the equations that you use here. Depending who you are, you find this either simple or complex. It's actually pretty simple, actually. This is not usually how things work in science, that you find out this simple rule like this, but it's a good illustration, right? It's not because we have simple things that the behavior is automatically simple. I like this quotation, the citation from Jean-Baptiste Perrin, the Nobel Prize winner, a long time ago, 100 years ago. And he said, it is a task of science to reduce complex visibles to simple invisibles. Right? The simplicity is not visible. These are models. This is what we find out. But we are in the age of data, so we cannot forget that we shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater. So I like also this quote from Einstein, which is, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler, right? So it's about finding the correct balance there. And I want to illustrate what is the actual way we do this by being a bit more concrete on a problem that I have worked on for some years, which is to try to understand the structure of networks, right? So the idea here is that observe some network, and you want to simplify it by finding these groups of nodes that are similar. This is called network clustering. It seems like a very simple task. In fact, a lot of people have developed their own methods to do that. And it's deceptive in its apparent simplicity. This is a kind of a problem that looks simpler than it is. And I want to illustrate, because if you want to find simple rules for things, we have to be afraid of not getting fooled by randomness, okay? So here is an example. This is a random network. It's a way of representing a random network. So here are the nodes, okay? So this is a matrix. So if there's a dot here in this matrix, it means that this node is connected to this node. So it's just a matrix representation of a network. Now, this matrix has been generated at random. For every possible entry here, just flipped a coin, right? An unbiased coin. So in the end, it's random. I'm going to show you exactly the same network again. I'm just going to relabel the nodes, going to give them different names. So what's here, number 2000 becomes 3000 and the other one and so forth. And if I do that, now the matrix looks like this. And now this doesn't look like a random network anymore. It looks like this group of nodes here has a stronger probability of connection between themselves. And this one here has also a stronger probability of connection between themselves, and they have a smaller probability between them. But I just told you the probability is the same. I'm going to do exactly the same thing again. I'm going to take this network, the same one. They're exactly the same network. They just have different names. I'm going to give a different labeling. And if I do that, I can make it look like this. Now it looks interesting, right? Maybe this is the minimal rule that I was looking for, right? Look, there's a kind of a community here. There's a core periphery structure going on there. Looks very interesting and rich. It's a random network. Again, the same thing. Now it looks like very elaborate, okay? So what's happening is this. If you search for patterns in data, you're going to find them. You're going to find them. So that's not what we want to do. I just don't want to find an explanation from my data that looks simple to me. That's not how it is. You have to be more methodic about this and more robust when you do this search. So how do we do this? Oh, well, then it gets interesting. That's why you need a research group to do this, right? That's why you need to work very hard. And the way, again, is to combine, to take from the disciplines that give the right answer. Here in this case, we should pay attention to information theory, right, and statistics. So that is very simple in the end of the day, right? What you want to do is come up with a little recipe for how the data is generated. And we evaluate how complex this recipe is. How do we do that? Well, we measure it in terms of how big is the computer program that you need to describe this, right? This is called the description length. So how many bits do you need to describe the model that you're using and the data together with this model? So here's an example of how you would construct a modular network. First, you would partition the nodes into groups, and then you would say how many edges go between the groups. Then you say what's the degree, how many connections each node receives, and then you wire everything together. So for this, you can compute the description length of the network, and then if you cluster it with different ways, you should find the one that minimizes the description length, the one that most compresses the data. And you cannot compress randomness. That's pretty much the definition of randomness, right? So the description of randomness is always very long. So what this does is that it gives us an implementation of Occam's razor. So the simplest explanation should be the most appropriate one, encoded via information theory. The simplest here has a shorter description length. Right. And so of course, to solve this problem, I wouldn't get these clusterings there, but it is more than just finding clusterings. There's a general way of comparing different hypotheses. So here's an example. This is a protein-protein interaction of the wild turkey, okay? And then this is here. So we know from information theory, this is a theorem, just mathematics, that the optimal compression is obtained by the true model, which means you cannot, the true generative model, which you don't know. We're trying to find out. So we can't go compress past this range. But we can come up with different hypotheses, and as soon as we compress it, we know we're doing better than the previous one. If you are compressing, right? They can be that you're not doing better. Then eventually, by following this gradient, we should approach the true model. So now you have ways of comparing different hypotheses, different mechanisms, and this is how we try to find the pendulum, right, in this chaotic motion. We try to come up with different rules, and if it's closer to the pendulum, we should compress the data more and more and more. And again, what's interesting, interdisciplinary bites us again, so to speak, because if you look at the mathematics of this problem of the clustering, if you look at what you obtained with, it looks very similar to, in this case, physicists and statisticians have been looking for studying for a long time. It's something called spin glasses. Again, it's something that has been used to model matter, but this structure is also found in this inference problem, right? So this is, the landscape of solutions. So this is, the partitions that most compress this network. There's this landscape, and then if you take this problem and you, evaluate how well its feasibility. So how well can I reconstruct? Can I find the correct clusters of a network if I generate the clusters myself? You find phase transitions in this algorithm, right? In this problem. And these phase transitions that you find are exactly the ones that you find in, for example, in disordered material like magnets. Right? It's exactly the same thing. So people were looking at magnets, you look at reconstructing clustering networks, turns out you're finding the same kind of phenomenology again. And this is something that hasn't gone unnoticed. It has been the subject of 2 recent Nobel Prizes in physics. So Giorgio Parisi, a couple of years ago, he was studying precisely this kind of system. Again, not only focused on matter, but also on algorithms and other kinds of problems. And more recently, Hopfield and Hinton also in the context of neural networks, they have been studying the same thing. It's interesting here that Hinton's not even a physicist. So even if the Nobel Prize Committee is being forced to recognize interdisciplinarity, it's not the most progressive institution. I think we have to accept it too. So we have been applying this kind of thing to many things. So for example, this is the study of migration. So migration is also a network process, and we're trying to find these elementary rules, these simple rules that can explain migration in Austria, for example. We have access now to an excellent data set from itu.austria, right? So essentially all the migration events in Austria for the past 20 years, and try to figure out what are the patterns there. This is something that connects to also the talk by Bernd. He's going to talk also about geospatial AI. So he deals also with this kind of thing. So there's a synergy in this sense. Here's an example of dynamical networks, right? Networks change over time. So we try to, this is a study done with volunteers, and they track, they wear devices which track their movements and their proximities. And then we can see, for example, in a primary school, in a hospital, what is the network of people moving around, and how, for example, disease could spread in the system. And we can model this using these kinds of methodologies. We can model things that at first don't seem like networks, like text, for example. We can find, we can model, this is the so-called bag of words model, where we model documents and the words that appear in these documents. We can find the structure in text using this kind of analysis as well, right? And something that we have been working on a lot recently is the idea of network reconstruction. This is very, very interesting. These are situations where indeed you don't observe the network. So the network is there, you don't see it. You generate some dynamics, and then you want to recover the network only from the dynamics. So things, for example, like contact tracing, right? So this was relevant during COVID. People are getting sick, but it's very hard for you to measure the transmissibility between people. You just know when they got sick, right? And from that, you want to reconstruct the contact patterns. Another example is the brain, right? You want to figure out how connected the neurons are. It's very invasive to go and check, how the brain is connected, but you could put people in an fMRI machine, and then you can see how the activity of the brain evolves over time. And then from that, you want to reconstruct the network, right? And you can employ the same approaches, and this is an example of the kind of thing you can do. This is a network, the reconstruct network of the human microbiome. So we have in our body, intestinal tract, in our digestive system, we have bacteria and they should be there. They're good. They're so important for metabolism. And you want to understand how one bacteria affects the other one. So they have interactions. They have mutualistic interactions. They have competitive interactions. But again, it's very cumbersome to do this experiment. Here there are like something like 40,000 different species. So if you want to check the interaction, the pairwise interaction between all of them, we have hundreds of millions of possible interactions. So you cannot possibly do that in the lab. But what you can do, you can take samples from people, and you can see how often such, you can do DNA sequencing, and you'll see, okay, this is the frequency of the bacterial population. Well, can we from this infer what is the network of interaction? And this is an example of this reconstruction. So this is a network of interactions of the human microbiome, and these different modules are different regions where the bacteria live. I think this is the mouth, this is intestine, so it's, and what you can do with this kind of thing is that you can take, here's an example, because this is not just a network for us to look at, this is really a model for the interactions between species. So you can do like a hypothetical experiment. So here's an example. We have these are the bacteria which are active. And then if we do a knockout of this bacteria, this causes a cascade and it kills off the other one. Right? So we can investigate what are the tipping points that can exist in a complex system, an ecological system, for example. So one thing we do a lot is software development. Stephanie mentioned this. So it's not just about developing such methods, the core theory, right? The core methodology and the applications. We want to empower other researchers as well. So we develop, we have this very large software package that allows people to employ such methodologies on their data. And we also collect a bunch of data and make this available for people to play with. So, of course, I should mention my lab. This is the people who help us in this work. My collaborators and, of course, people who fund the work. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tiago. As you've seen, networks everywhere can be applied to a lot of different things, and I'm sure in your organizations and your industries there's a lot of application cases for it. And Tiago calls himself an undisciplined researcher, so this is a step further than interdisciplinary researcher, and so he's also happy to engage with you in all sorts of discussions and application cases. But first, are there any questions for this specific talk? We will then have Bernd's talk, and then we'll have more questions possible, maybe just understanding aspects which you might want to ask. Yes?
Maybe, first of all, thank you so much. It was extremely inspiring. I have maybe a very silly question. Can you also give us examples, if any, of networks that are complex or systems that are complex and complicated?
Oh, very much so, absolutely. So this is not every system is a complex system in this sense. So there are many systems which are complicated. In biology, for example, like I would never say that the whole behavior of a human body can be explained with a simple equation. So that's not really the point. I think so there are many examples, many systems which are complicated. But the question is how complicated? It's a matter of gradation. It's not a yes or no, simple versus complex, but how complicated are they really, right? So how far can you go in the compression? How many bits do you need to describe the human body? Like, these are highly non-trivial questions, right? So it's a matter of gradation. I think, and in fact, these examples that I showed at the beginning, they are so-called toy models. They are models that explain the fundamental mechanism, but they're not very good, for example, at giving quantitative prediction. Like you may have noticed that the flocking models that I use are not exactly like the flocking that we saw in the video. There's always some little differences, right? So these little differences are higher other effects that haven't been captured by the minimal model, the toy model, right, which has been, the purpose are just to bring understanding more than anything. But if you want to compare with data, then you have to include more complexity. But how much, right? So that's the question. You want to achieve the least amount of complexity necessary to reproduce what you're seeing.
Yeah.
I have a question on the slide with the randomness, because usually when you transfer from this perfect random to the more ordered structures, there should be something which in physics one calls Erhaltungsgröße or conservation. So what is is there any quantity which is conserved if you go from this first to the second image or to the third image?
Well,
on the network
yes,
on the node connect.
Yeah, so remember that in this case, the network is exactly the same. I'm just changing the partition, right? So it's the same network. So of course, something like the likelihood or the energy, if I would say, is changing, right? Because I'm increasing the number of constraints. So if I'm clustering the network in a smaller number of groups, I'm increasing the constraints of the system, the energy is lowering. So there is no conservation quantity going on here, right? So there's not an equilibrium system in that sense. So there's no conservation, right, in this particular example.
My second question would be on phase transitions, because you have phase transition in open systems. Is there something like a correlation length? In equilibrium, the correlation length for superconductivity or whatever is also for open systems something equivalent. Like
you do see these things as well. I think it's of course it gets more complicated, right, when you go to non-equilibrium systems. But you see many of these effects. You see correlation lengths as well. You see most of the phenomenology you see equilibrium systems. You see also for non-equilibrium systems. But they're also kind of strange things which are incoherent in a non-equilibrium system from the point of view of these equilibrium quantities. But you see all of these things. So divergences, if you see critical points, divergences around the critical points, critical exponents, all these things are visible there as well.
Thank you, Tiago. Let us give you a hand again. And with this, I would like to introduce Bernd Resch. So this is a non-linear lifeline, so to say. Bernd started his academic career very close to Linz, namely in Salzburg. This is where he started with his PhD in computer science, but immediately he created this link to the MIT and did his PhD basically between these two organizations. And then yeah, he slowly transversed through Europe, Osnabrück, Heidelberg, and then back to Salzburg. And in between of this, he started a strong collaboration with Harvard University, which has been going on for 15 years or so by now. And now he is one of our founding professors here in Linz at ITU. So he has a strong background in computer science. Just this afternoon when he talked, he said, at some point in time, bits and bytes just were not enough for me. It was just not interesting enough. And this is why then he started looking into real-world monitoring of environments, of natural environments, and then over time realized that the social environments is really what interests him most. And this is also shown in his great ability for science communication, because besides doing a whole really cool research, he's also very active in communicating science, not only to the general public, but also to schools and to children. And with this, I would like to hand over to you, Bernd, and give you the floor.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. That's too much. So first of all, thanks everybody for coming in and for showing up on site and online. Just reverting back to what Tiago just said, that's basically his view of the world, no? Like that's most, like he thinks in networks. And I would say, yes, that's a network, and that's also representing our world to some degree. But then that's probably also a network that represents our world, which could be a network of, I don't know, users, which could be users in social media, for example, still virtualized in a virtual network. But then this could be also a network, which is a network of people, I mean, old-fashioned, but still interacting physically, no, or interacting face-to-face. And this would be the network, the next one, which would span across the entire globe to say, look, we actually live on the same planet, so there may be some interaction that span more than locally, as I said, could be global, could be regionally. And then, of course, this. So that's the switch that Stephanie also made before. We try to understand processes, but we also try to shape them. Our globe is in our hands, so to say, right? We try to shape our own futures, and that's a bit of our understanding of our research as well, to go beyond just seeing patterns in data. Good, and this is why we called our research group the Geosocial Artificial Intelligence Research Group. I'm just going to say what this is in a second. But again, spatial sensing and actuating. Sensing, trying to understand what happens. Actuating, really trying to give back our insights into a number of contexts from policymaking to real-world installations. Good. So this is where we start from. You all know this, right? The Maslow pyramid of basic human needs, which is basically, we all saw it in high school. Yes, of course, I can care about my physiological needs, like if I have air, water, shelter, and so on, safety, security, social connections, and so on. But then again, you know, if I'm not connected to the internet, I get a little bit uneasy. And then when my battery is dying, you know, I have some quite complex, perhaps, and fundamental existential questions there. And that's the world we live in, basically, right? First thing you walk into a meeting was the Wi-Fi code, always the same. So these are just examples of what our world looks like. First of all, of course, we're communicating all the time. Some of us, even right now, we're always online. We're basically leaving footprints in everything we do all day long. This could be in social media. We post all different kinds of things. Could be jibber jabber, you know, deciphering what we speak, what we write is not always that easy because human language is very redundant and is not very exact either. But this could be also different modalities, different data types. Not only text, could also be emotions that I express, could be videos I post, could be images, could be all different kinds of things. And the second part we're seeing is this quantified self-movement, where people try to measure themselves, right? That's a quite a tendency there. We don't go running for getting fit anymore, but for bragging about it on the internet, no? And that's the instrument for that. And all this generates a lot of information, like signal data, right? And all this, and that's the important thing, geosocial, it's contextualized by geographic space and time. If I don't know where this picture was taken, it's pretty worth it. If I know where and when it was taken, it tells me a lot. Good, so just one example, like how we think about larger data sources. So this is an example from quite a while back. Everybody knows what city that is? Is it? Oh, sorry. Okay, the Colosseo, the Tiba, the main station. So what we're going to look at is what happens in the mobile phone network, sorry, in not a usual day, but the day of the World Cup finals, soccer, Italy. Don't have to say more. So the city wakes up here in the timeline, 10 in the morning, a little bit later than usually. And then we see like people are communicating all over the place. And the further we go towards the beginning of the game, the more intense it gets. And all of a sudden, when the game starts, it drops and there is nothing happening in the middle of the evening. And then halftime, very quick push-ups, so to say, and people will go to the toilet, to the fridge. Nothing happens again. The city is dead, right? Nobody's there at 8 in the evening. And then all of a sudden, when Italy wins, we see everything explode there, and everybody's celebrating. Now, of course, what you can say is this is playing around with data, and that's what it is. But the fundamental thing we can learn from here is that in real time, we get an insight into a social process from remote. We don't have to be there to understand what's happening there, right? And if we do not have only mobile phone densities, but social media posts, all different kinds of open data sets that we can combine, we may have a good chance of seeing and understanding what's actually happening there. So, as mentioned before, GeoAI is the thing we're going to, or what we're doing. Now, there is two parts of this term, right? Geospatial and artificial intelligence. And I'm going to show just two very quick motivations why we think that is important. The geospatial part. This is Walter Tobler's first law of geography, which is not a law, but similar to a law. Everything is related to everything, but near things are more related than distant things. So what's that mean? For example, if I measure ambient temperature in Linz right now, the temperature in Salzburg may be very similar. The temperature in Wien may be very similar. The temperature in Rome is less likely to be similar. The temperature in Melbourne is very unlikely to be similar out of the same process, right? And that's where we have physical connections that make two features, in this case, two measurement points, interact. The same with noise, which would be very, very much fine-grained. Ambient temperature would be a bit more coarsely grained. And that's exactly what we're seeing in all different kinds of spatial analysis. So this is a very simple, in this case, hotspot analysis. I'm going to show the results in a second. But the holy grail in there is not the formula itself, but this W here is the ominous one. It's the weights matrix. How do I relate two features that are distant or close in space with each other? How similar are they? And this differs very strongly depending on the phenomenon that we want to investigate, whether we want to investigate ambient temperature, noise, a disease spreading, refugee or migration movements, whatever it is. And this is a bit like the research of the geospatial part that we're going into. And then the motivation for AI, that's a bit the formalized one. Why are we thinking about AI? Because standard statistics usually do not do the trick for us. Why? Because many statistical methods actually require very specific statistical data properties. And that's an issue. Because the data we use, for example, social media posts, they have not been acquired for a specific measurement purpose. But people are just sitting there and talking what they think, right? It's not standardized. And that's what makes this impossible. Stationarity, first and second order, spatial and temporal. What does that mean? If I have a data set, for example, social media posts of the US for a year, if I would take two random subsamples from different locations, from different points in time, they would have to fulfill the same statistical properties. Constant mean, variance, and autocovariance. And that's a problem, because that's never true for these user-generated data. The same thing for linearity, a process being modelable through a linear system. Homogeneity, few outliers and little noise, obviously not the case in social media data and or user-generated data. And that is multidimensional, multimodal nature. How do you combine emotion with text, with an image, and with geographic position? Not that easy, to find a statistical approach. So AI helps us a lot there. Good, so this was just the motivation to get things straight. And what I would do now is just to take a look a little bit into the concrete research that we're doing in our group. First of all, collective data, a window to our world. This is a time series of 2 weeks of social media posts, and we see very characteristic patterns that are basically replicable. So people post a lot in the evening until 11 or so, then it drops sharply, goes up again at 6, then you have this small little dip in over lunchtime, and during the week, people would post a little bit more as compared to the weekend and so on. So these are known patterns. That's the same in social media posts, in mobile phone activity, all different kinds of user-generated data. And now you see this. And that's obviously a pretty strong anomaly if we talk in time series data analysis terms. If we zoom into that, we see that. In orange, that's a standard Sunday, basically. So during the night, from midnight to 6 in the morning, nobody posts, everybody sleeps. A week later, another Sunday, the blue curve does exactly the same. It goes down close to 0, and all of a sudden, we have this 90-degree really spike. And you can guess what happens. Yes, okay, it's written again. That's when the earthquake occurred. And you can also guess when the earthquake occurred. 3:20, 3:21, there is 0 minutes delay. So basically what happens is, if you're shaken out of bed by a 6.2 magnitude earthquake, the first thing you have to do, obviously, is to grab your phone and post on the internet, shaking, have you felt, and so on, destruction, and so on. Sociologically speaking, psychologically speaking, a very interesting phenomenon. What's great for us, these data are just available and free for download on the internet, more or less. Good. Temporal view, and that's the spatial view, and that's how we get in. This is the result, by the way, of a multi-step AI process, including this get-this-or-GS star statistics that I showed before for spatial hotspot analysis. That's important because this is the result of our social media analysis, and what it says is the red areas are those where the earthquake has been felt, which have been affected by the earthquake. In blue, yes, people are talking also about the earthquake, but it has not been affected. In yellow, well, we're not so sure. So you still see we talk about probabilities, right? We're still in statistics, meaning confidence intervals in this case. Still, of course, we do a ground truth, if you will, a reality check. For example, in this case, overlaying with the USGS earthquake footprint that is really measured with seismograph, right? Like how strongly the earth was shaking. And if we overlay that, we see pretty strongly actually that the red and the green areas overlap. Of course, we only see these red areas where people live, where they don't know where it posts much. So that's where we're a little bit blind, obviously. Good, so that's the disaster management case, which I'm going to get back to in a second. The beauty of the approach is if we change a few bits and pieces, we can transfer that to a number of different use cases, application scenarios. Epidemiology. This is the COVID-19 curve as observed in social media. And you see a very strong signal, and you see a very distinct and pronounced peak. And this basically, although it comes from the US here, it's basically the same in all other countries, more or less, around Europe and so on. Good. So again, temporal. Now, the cool thing is, if we take a look at the right side here, we see two curves. The red one is the COVID-19 cases curve, the daily new confirmed cases of COVID-19. The blue curve, again, is the COVID-19 curve, as in social media. And now what we proved in this science publication together with Harvard Medical School and Northeastern is that there is a gap of 14 to 17 days between the social media curve and the epidemic curve. Meaning, we have an early warning capability of social media posts for a variety of use cases, in this case, epidemiology. So first, when you see the social media curve rising, you can expect 2 weeks after the COVID-19 curve rising. And that's a pretty amazing thing, actually, because this gives us not only a real-time insight, but even a predictive power. Temporal view, spatial view. Again, right? The same hotspots that we saw before, but in this case, we don't talk about earthquakes, but we talk about COVID-19. These are really epidemiological hotspots. And you can see over time how they progress, basically, how they disappear, then reappear, they stabilize, then cold spots turn up where we're pretty sure that nothing's happening. For yellow, again, we're not so sure. They are jumping a little bit. They are moving in space and time. Good, and this, of course, can inform a number of things, including policymaking. How do you, I don't know, talk about curfews on a national level with like 330 million people? You want to be fine-grained, right? You want to have targeted interactions and interventions. This does the trick. Same thing with vaccination testing. Where do I test my newly developed vaccine so that people would be exposed to the virus in 2-3 weeks' time, because we have 30 test centers in the US, for example. Good, linking back to Tiago, another use case here. Migration/refugees in this case. Same visualizations, we have a lot in common, obviously. That's a network, I would rather say a trajectory in our case, which is pretty much the same. People move from A to B to C throughout space, but not as observed through statistical data of migration, but through social media again. Either people have their GPS on, more or less, and we see them move through space, so say when they post, or they tell us where they go. I'm just waiting for the train in Budapest for going to Vienna, be there in like 2.5 hours, right? So verbally expressing themselves. And like this, we can generate this, which is an inherently spatial representation. We go from Turkey, you see these arrows, right? You go from Turkey to Greece, Greece to Northern Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, then Slovenia and Hungary, and then into Austria and further to Germany. It's actually trajectory in space and time. That's a very interesting. Then the final one for the collective data. This is a network of conspiracy actors. That's real data, by the way. It's a real network. It's not just an artistic visualization. What did we do together with communication scientists? Define the 5 most influential actors of conspiracy theories in Austria, and then crawl their followers and crawl their followers, 2 hierarchy levels. This resulted in a network of 6 million users, which spans across the globe, obviously, very quickly. You know the 7 degrees of separation, like personally speaking, in social media, it goes very quickly. Good. So this is just a depiction of the network itself. You see these information highways, so to say, across the pond here to the US, but also down towards Southeast Asia and Australia. Now, this is just a, let's say, geographic representation of a virtual network. But then again, those users sit somewhere, right? I mean, they have a home base. We're all embodied, so to say. And if we do what exactly Tiago mentioned before, namely a community detection. You remember those 4 communities in purple, orange, blue, and green it was, where we find densely connected subnetworks. So we have our entire network, and then we have a group of people who talks a lot to each other, but not so much to other groups who talk a lot to each other. So we can cut that through in a virtual space, just in a network without any geographic representation, and then plot it on the map. And what's quite surprising is that we're exactly redrawing national borders. Austria, Switzerland, Germany, the Benelux states, UK, and so on. So there are many reasons for that, which are not utterly clear, also discussing this with communication scientists. But the surprising thing is, even though on the internet we follow and communicate and like every kind of content that comes into our feed, we are still very, very strongly connected to people in our country. Good, so this is the second part now of our research, which is detecting stress in wearables. What the spatial part is, I'm gonna say in a second. So that's how we start. This is people sitting in the lab in one of our lab tests, and we try to induce stress to understand what the physiological reaction to an emotion psychological process is. So when people feel stress, acute stress, which is this flight reflex basically, or an emotion in the more complex case, then your body would react. For example, it would emit cold sweat, and this is what it can measure. And that's why we measure EDA, electrodermal activity, heart rate variability, skin temperature, and others. Good. Now, this is our lab test, controlled environment, right? We have people sitting there. They are not allowed to talk, to interact. They just don't even think if possible. Now, this is our stressor. That's the air horn. And if you operate an air horn, people just will get like a quite quick flash, right? And what you see is in these vertical dashed lines, we operate the air horn in irregular intervals. And you see a very, very strong signal in the reaction, the bodily reaction of a person, right? 3 seconds after, galvanic skin response would rise a lot. And this is what we try to model then in order to detect stress. Why are we doing this? To produce something like that. Of course, geo again, right? We measure those bodily parameters. That's the measurement time series, a very prototypical one. And then, if we do this with many people, we see these. Meaning, again, in red, areas of clustered stress, meaning where many people intersubjectively feel stressed or unsafe. In blue, relaxed. In this case, the use case is walkability, pedestrians. We also do it with cyclists. Now, we can take a look what happened in the real world, so to say, as a bit of a ground reference with body-worn cameras. And then we ask people post hoc to really tell us what they thought and what they felt. So they can zoom in into a map and pinpoint where they felt what and why. Because then we can contextualize this measurement time series through aspects and situations that happened in the real world. Qualitative interview is not our core strength, but we do it as well if we have to. Good, so that's this multimodal and interdisciplinary research point of view. That's what it looks like in reality. So this is a person cycling down Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, and you see that this person already wanted to turn, wearing our sensors, and then this very close overtaking maneuver comes up. This person is half standing on the street. I don't know why the street, there's a red, that's a bit fishy there. But then again, this situation obviously causes stress, and that's what we can measure. Now you see that this person cycled down this route here, and in irregular intervals, the person would exhibit these stress moments. We don't do it with one person, but with many, we see these patterns again, right? And this is exactly what we discussed with city governments. What can we do here? What can we do here? Can we understand what it is? How can we improve that through a targeted intervention? By the way, this is, of course, together with our partners from KIT, Peter Zeile, in the Urban Emotions Initiative that has been running for like 10 plus years as well. Good, now we put people in the lab and we ask them to participate in our studies and we generate some data, which is nice. We measure data, right? But then again, to train a machine learning model, you know that those are usually data hungry. So we can have 100 people in the lab, we cannot have 1 million people in the lab. And that's why we thought about how can we generate synthetic data for actually training our models. And what has been happening with generative adversarial networks, which is now like a bit of old school again still, for 7 years now with images, and it is working very well, obviously. None of these persons exist really, right? It's generated images, is not so simple with measurement time series, like temporal signals. And jumping over steps, that's the result. So two of these series you see here are generated, 2 of them are measured in the lab. Now, of course, we tried to check whether this works well. Yes, it works well. Statistically speaking, our machine learning model performs well in terms of, let's say, the confusion matrix, right? Yes, we did well there. But the more important thing is we really want to understand the phenomenon. Is what's generated really representing stress in this case? And this is why we had an expert-based evaluation, which basically we did with University Hospital Zurich, with cardiologists, with emotion psychologists, with people who know the data and work with the data, and asked them, do you think that this is generated or a real sequence, like a measured sequence? And people could not distinguish. That's what basically this figure close to 0.5 says. Good, so it works obviously, and that's something where we are able to generate large data sets that have the same characteristics than the original measured ones, that then help us to train our machine learning models. Good, and that's the final conclusion here. So just 3 examples on how we try to bridge science and society. Now, there is always these, let's say, 3 missions of universities, which is research is clear, teaching education is pretty clear. 3rd mission, yeah, a little bit neglected sometimes. And that's why we have a very strong, let's say, commitment to the 3rd mission as well, bridging science and society here. Just 3 examples. First of all, evidence-based policymaking and interventions. The region of Salzburg, the regional government in Salzburg approached us and told us, look, we have a bit of a suspicion that there may be a dangerous situation out in the wild, in the real world, which is people for doing the groceries have to walk along a quite strongly frequented street, a road. And we think that's not a great situation. So what we did is we put our data there. We had a cohort of study participants. We did this interdisciplinary analysis that I mentioned before in the workflow, right? And then we also, of course, took some pictures, body-worn cameras, and that was the output. So human sensing was there for safety assessment, right? Trying to see how people feel subjectively and objectively measured as well. So you see a lot of red here, right? Not a great situation. Very fast cars, very narrow overtaking maneuvers, all different kinds of feedback that also coincides with the measured data we had. And if you take a look, for example, at this picture, you see what the real-world situation is, that it's obviously not really safe. Now, what I want to say here is the regional government in Salzburg said, this is great because now we have scientific evidence as a basis for doing an intervention, for realizing an intervention out in the real world, so to say. And what they did is to build a cyclopath and a footpath right next to this road to increase traffic safety for pedestrians and cyclists. The second one is this, AI in disaster management. So we had a large-scale disaster exercise 2 years ago in Salzburg. So the idea was we had 900 action forces out in the wild. So these were really like people working out there with a crisis management board that you see down here, which was built up in the situation room, so to say, in the ideas lab in Salzburg. And this was the digital crisis management center. Digital is written in caps here because, let's say, crisis management is a little bit analog still mostly. Now, the goal was to evaluate the usefulness of the usability of the information we provide. What you saw before. Hotspots, of course, social media posts, complemented by drone images and satellite images. And we had 4 disaster areas, which was a collapsing building, which was a derailed train, which was even carrying dangerous chemicals. So we had a CBRN unit there as well. People having to be rescued from their flooded houses, fled on their roofs basically, and then people caught in the Salzach River. So these were the 4 areas, all caused by a fictitious, in this case, large-scale flooding event. And what that looked like in practice, I'm just going to show.
In a large-scale disaster management exercise, the IFA field exercise, the cooperation between science and emergency management operations was tested at 4 locations in the city of Salzburg and surrounding regions, supported through a high-tech operations center. The exercise assumed a severe storm event causing large-scale flooding. Spectacular rescue operations were performed in Seekirchen, the city of Salzburg, Oberndorf, and Kuchel. I can summarize that the exercise goal was achieved and that the information, which has been produced by the analysis of artificial intelligence algorithms, can strongly support us in operational management. This exercise is of interest to disaster management operations in 3 ways. Firstly, the analysis of geosocial media data and the use of artificial intelligence in order to be able to identify disaster hotspots even more quickly. In other words, where is something happening at what time? The second point is the provision of live images from drones or helicopters, which can be fed into control centers. And the third aspect is the intersection and interaction between science and research. In this case, geoinformatics research provides...
This, of course, guy, this says how important research is, of course. The idea was that we really, let's say, bridge this, I don't know, which is oftentimes a gap between all the formulas we're showing and all the AI methods we're using to really being usable out there in the world. And that's always a bit of a challenge, obviously. And that's finally science communication. So we have a very strong commitment to providing cutting-edge research and new technologies to the broad public, which is, of course, mostly pupils and teacher education to really give people new instruments at hand to, first of all, understand digitalization, artificial intelligence, and so on, in interactive formats from field exercises to data acquisition campaigns, to, let's say, interactive workshops, discussion rounds, all different kinds of things. On site, yes, of course, here, but also pop-up. We also work with schools at their premises. Societal impact. This is the key conclusions after I quickly say that this is our lab that and the lab members who contribute to all of that, what I'm able to present today, having grown quite quickly over the past few weeks and months. Good. Final key conclusions. First of all, understanding. Machine learning was oftentimes generating and seeing patterns, right? And then you see a pattern, and it's great that you saw a pattern, but do you understand the pattern? Do you really understand what you see, or is it spurious, or is it randomness, or whatever? And then, of course, we also want to take this turn to really go out into the world and try to shape it from the knowledge we have generated. Simplification, Tiago has talked a lot. Agentic AI and multimodal learning is going to drive us for the next years in our group a lot. More discussion, happy to go. And then we go to ITU, right? And this is where we say interdisciplinarity. Yes, of course. I wouldn't tick the box in this sense. But I mean, as we saw, I guess we're doing this inherently already. We're not stuck in our boxes, but we're talking to a lot of different people. And we also embrace changing job descriptions in a changing world. 65%, that's the saying, of all jobs that our kids will do not even exist yet. So what do we give them? What do they need in like 20 years? 5 years ago, we would have said, yeah, they need to be able to code and they need to be tech savvy and good with computers and so on. All hard skills, all technical. Now we say the top 3 are basically creativity, communication, and flexibility. Creativity, solving problems that you have not seen before. Flexibility, keeping up with everything, like this very, very fast developing world, technologies, concepts, also society as a whole. And of course, communication internally, but also to the external world. Visualizing, but also defending and discussing our approaches. And that's a bit of the impact that we want to make, right? The impact, yes, of course, we all have an impact factor and we pat ourselves for being good scientists in a way, in that we have age indices and so on. But we want to go beyond the confusion matrix, right? It's really understanding what we see and then really creating a value out in the world. That's our mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernd. So I couldn't have said it better. What's the mission of ITU to really create impact? Maybe we already have you up on the stage, and we start But we first start with some questions maybe on Bernd's talk. Are there any direct questions here? We could start that.
It was amazing. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. I was just wondering, when you were talking, when we have all of these amazing things that we do and we can actually create a wonderful new world, all this also might be used for negative purposes, and how we can mitigate it. Because, there could be also some people somewhere around who use the same thing to do fraud. And then what would be the measurement against it?
Absolutely, and I guess that's a wider discussion as a whole. If you do technical research, computer science-oriented research, AI research, there was always this issue of dual use, right? So for every single research proposal you submit, you have to cross a box, 100% civilian use. If you open source something, of course, everybody can use that, right? And there is this concept of open source intelligence as well, like combining all different data sources and all different kind of algorithms, and then try and make sense of that for whatever purposes. So this is a bit hard to answer because that's a very general problem of technology developments and research in itself today.
Okay, I'm sure there will be more questions coming up now throughout our little discussion, which we are having now. As always, at the first lectures, I ask, how did you start doing interdisciplinary research? Why not just stick with physics?
Well, in my case, indeed, I thought that very often the theories and the mathematics are very interesting, but the actual systems were not. So for example, I spent a long time studying polymer physics, and I went to this conference and everybody was talking about polymers, so you should think about little lengths of materials doing this. And the mathematics was very interesting, but in the end of the day, if somebody would ask me what I was doing, I would actually get bored instantaneously. Because once you take out the mathematics, what remains, it's a relatively uninteresting. However, once you start talking, but I was much more motivated about studying, society, biological systems, social media. This is what was a lot more interesting, diseases, and the same phenomenology is there, right? There was no reason not to go in this direction. I thought it was a very, as I mentioned in my talk, it's an artificial thing for us to put a boundary there and say, no, if there is the water flowing, that's physics. If disease, it's not. I mean, that's an arbitrary way of looking at the world.
But then suddenly you get into messy situations,
it gets more
right?
interesting, but that's what you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe physicists normally don't want.
No. It gets more interesting, absolutely.
Yeah. What about you, Bernd?
Yeah, you mentioned it before, right? This, let's say, totally computer science-driven view, for me at least, was not the right thing. I'm not saying that this is not needed, but for me, it was just like, hey, trying that out in the real world in different contexts is just very much exciting. And then measuring environmental parameters was the very technical thing still. And I was like, okay, rather than the natural environment, and I'm actually more interested in the social environment because it's, again, very messy. It's hard to understand. You have a variety of different data, and you have to find clever ways of how to combine them to actually create understanding of the phenomenon you want to investigate. And that also entails interdisciplinarity in that sense, that you also need to speak the language of other disciplines, right? Like, how do you communicate with a disaster manager, and tomorrow you talk to an epidemiologist, and the day after you talk to a communication scientist. They all have different languages, different terms, different understandings, different theories you need to cover as well. And that's something which is challenging, and this, I think, makes the gist.
And that's also the hard part, right? Because on one hand, it's the language, but also the methods they are using, which you might want to adopt or not, or converge with your own.
Definitely. I mean, mixed methods is always the big challenge for us, right? Quantitative, qualitative data, qualitative methods. How do you ever combine them? And even publish them, right? Like sometimes for a mixed methods paper, you would get single disciplinary reviews, and then they reject you because you're not strong enough, I don't know, on the social science side. But then you say, yeah, but I'm not a social science paper either, right? So how do we find this common ground to understand the value of combining things, which of course entails that we cannot by definition be excellent, top of the world for both or all three of the disciplines, but the combination actually creates the value.
It's fun. I mean, so if you look at some, Bernd put some citations, if you actually would look at the names, they were all from different disciplines, right, very often. So this is something that exists already, right? It's, there are collaborations, there are conferences where you go to where you do talk with people from different disciplines. So it's very engaging, actually. It's very interesting.
Yeah, fun is a very good word. I think this is what we want to do at ITU. We have fun in doing research and fun and also in educating our students. So why do you both think it is so incredibly important to make the invisible visible?
Well, I think that's almost tautological, my point of view. Like understanding is the same as simplification. So if you only understand something if you see the simplicity in it. I mean, you have to be somebody truly very super intelligent to understand the complexity. That's hard to do, right? I think it's almost a tautological thing. So that's the only thing we have, right? Is to find explanations. And explanations mean simplifications, right? So this is how I see it.
Yeah, from my point of view, it's also I think a lot of our systems like the stock market. There are so many things going on which you cannot understand, and it's very much invisible what's happening. And I think what would be our chance or our mission here at ITU is to try to make these kind of systems visible and to talk to people about these systems and how to maybe also influence these systems. You have some examples and ideas about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'm always intrigued by is, as Tiago mentioned before, we are in this age of data at the moment, right? We have lots more data as compared to 20 years ago available. Now, I'm not let's say, very strong proponent of data-driven research. Just looking at the data and seeing whatever patterns, and then you observe that X, Y, Z. Could be spurious, could be wrong, could be plain not in line with existing theory. Now, what I think where the strength now comes from is that from the data we now have, we can generate new hypotheses, right? You have discovered some patterns in the data set, and it can inform what your research is. For example, if you have 5 known factors, I don't know, bodily measurements or whatever, where you know they lead to cancer for a certain probability, why not extend that to 15 instead of 5? In a very quick fashion. That's happening, for example, in vaccine research right now, right? Like testing simulation is getting way faster, and that's how research can inform itself, but also across disciplines.
Mm-hmm. You want to add anything on this?
No, I agree. I think if you want to act right on the world, you have to understand it. You have to find out which are the spurious patterns, which are not, and this involves finding the invisibles. Right, and exposing what the hidden structures, right, of the system that we see.
So with this, I would like to open the floor for questions from everybody here in the room, also for the people online. We have Florian sitting here monitoring the chat, so letting me know if there are questions. Yes?
About the tweaks and the earthquake. I find it very interesting, and I was wondering if you looked inside why the people actually start to tweak that much, because I mean, I'm a psychologist, and I remember there are some studies about post-traumatic stress disorder and firefighters giving people that experience, let's say, natural catastrophe, Tetris, and ask them to play Tetris, and in the long run, this reduced the symptoms of PTSD. And so I was wondering, because at first it looks silly, because it looks like people want to have attention because there is an earthquake happening, but it can have also like very beneficial effects.
So first of all, there is a great first lecture in 2 weeks by Jimmy and Nina Hubik, who are the very qualified experts for that. So psychologically speaking, I have no strong background at all, right? Not a great understanding. Why people sit down at 11 in the evening and start posting whatever, it's a very vague process, which I don't have a grasp basically at all. The idea of collaborating with psychologists for us is more the stress measurements, which is a very strong connection. The the mindset why people would feel a motivation to set off a social media post, I'm basically blind there. I don't know. I can just reverse engineer from the data, so to say, right? And of course, by the way, that's an important thing. We're interested in collective patterns, right? As I mentioned in my subheading as well. We're not so much interested because we just can't. Interested in the individual behavior. That's a totally different set of skills and stories as well. But happy to talk afterwards as well, right?
Just wanted to say, so maybe that's the next research project going on. Any more questions?
On the topic of reverse engineering. So if we take output, for example, from ChatGPT, could you reverse engineer the rules of the neural network behind it?
That's a big research program. I mean, that's exactly, so absolutely. You can think of these big neural networks as a kind of a complex systems. If you look at the neurons themselves, they're very simple functions. Just sum all the inputs, weight with some weights, and there's an activation function. As you can draw it in the blackboard. But then you put them, thousands of these together in deep hierarchy, then this thing can distinguish a dog from a cat, or it can generate text if you run in the inverse, right, and write poetry. So this is an example of emergent behavior. So there are lots of people employing the methods that I have described, trying to understand how this is happening. So this is an ongoing research program. It's difficult. It is not like there's going to be a simple equation, but a lot of things have been discovered already about this, about what you know, how much layers it should have, what's the effect. You know, there are many hidden. There are many initially puzzling facts that have now been understood. For example, why isn't this thing overfitting, right? It should be overfitting. There's better understanding now why this is not happening, right? So there's a bunch of things, but this is work in progress. But definitely, there's a lot of people with the kind of background that I have and connected, you know, there are a bunch of physicists working on this together with computer scientists, trying to understand this using the methodology that I have described. So this is an ongoing quest to do this reverse engineering, absolutely. These AI systems, artificial intelligence or machine learning, right? The machine is doing the learning, and now is the time for the humans to do the learning and learn what these things are learning, right? Yeah.
Any more questions? Yes.
I was wondering about your point concerning we have data and we can generate multiple hypotheses and so on. So, I mean, to a certain degree, I completely agree with you. That's a nice point to say. On the other, from another perspective, I think the more hypotheses we generate, the more there is the danger that some hypotheses become true, so to say, just for randomness, because I can really generate arbitrary complex hypotheses. So what's your, what do you think about that? And maybe also from you, what's your point of view on complexity?
Right, I think that one nice approach about quantifying complexity in the way I have done, which is really the number of bits you need, right, from information theory, is that it protects you against this because you cannot compress randomness. There are challenges. Sometimes people don't have a hard time accepting this, but there are online challenges, which is, you know, that people have generated random bits, and if you can compress this, you get a prize. Right? It's impossible mathematically, but we'll try anyway, right? So there is it's something that's just in the mathematics of information that you can't really compress randomness more than, you know, its original amount. That's pretty much the definition. So if you guide yourself by this, by how much information you are using, you are protected precisely against it, because if your explanation is spurious, it will not compress. Now, there are a bunch of caveats that I haven't talked about, right? Because I couldn't go into the technical details. It might be that you have 2 or 3 or 10 or 100 explanations which have the same description and the same explainability power. Then you can't tell which one it is. This will happen very often if your data is insufficient, for example, or too sparse. So it's not always that you can find. Sometimes you find competing explanations which are equally probable from this point of view. But from a point of view simply of introducing spurious complexity, I think that this way of thinking is very robust.
Perhaps adding from just one example, and I think there are many, how we got into this collaboration and research with psychologists is we did not really, it was not our goal to understand how a physiological process is caused by an emotion psychological one, right? But it was for us the pathway towards understanding how geographic space causes or influences emotions. Now, we went in there and said, okay, let's measure something and let's see what happens. And what came out were these very strong spikes, right? And this was not really known before in psychology either. I was a bit surprised, like 10 years ago, I thought, let's walk up to psychologists. They tell us exactly how we measure stress. You measure these and these parameters. Here is the library which you analyze it with, and then you get your moments of stress. This has not been existent. So our papers were really the first ones to be there. How did it work? We generated those data and told psychologists, hey, do you find this plausible? Do you think we can wrap a hypothesis, a theory around that, how that works? And we could, right? And that's, without the data, we could always have theorized before and then prove it afterwards. But in this case, we just went backwards, right? Reverse engineering as well. And there are many different examples for that, just to observe something, try to interpret. I agree that robustness, I think, is not really an issue from the interpretability. And then weighing this against existing theory and empirical findings is the thing that underpins the findings themselves, no?
Someone clever said, like, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I want to maybe ask you, right? You said, like, you want to find the simplest model for behavior that you can observe, right? But how big is the danger that the model is actually too simple? Because the data that you observe is not giving you all the possible things that a system can do. So you sort of like create a very simplistic explanation for something that is actually much more complicated. I'm thinking about, I don't know, immigration or migration paths, right? And there might be a lot of things behind that that you don't see observed in a particular data set. And then how can we, and if we accept that, how can we actually assess the limits of what these models can tell us?
This is a excellent question. You're absolutely right. You cannot go beyond what your data is telling you. And this happens all the time. And this is something that we investigate also when we're developing the methods, right? I mean, a question that you always ask is, okay, we have a generative model that we're using. Okay, what happens if I generate data from this model? So now we know the truth. How far can we recover it? And it is a very rich question. We get detectability transitions, right? We see, for example, situations where there needs to be enough signal. That's actually, I showed this, the phase transition there. That's precisely this. Only if the signal in the data crosses a certain threshold, only then you start detecting it. So we can pretty much prove what you're saying, that there is a regime where we know that there is structure there, and we can prove to you that it's impossible to find that structure with the method. So these limits totally exist, absolutely. And this class is full of limitations which are inherent in the whole mathematics of the thing. So it's a certainty then that there will be situations that, like the one you were describing. So absolutely, we shouldn't then, it's always, the data will only go to a certain point. So in fact, I had to simplify when I was giving the talk, but this limit there of, I said that the true model is the one that compresses optimally, asymptotically, okay? Pre-asymptotic, when the data is not sufficient, there will be many alternative explanations that are equally good, and then you cannot tell which one is really the true one. So it's full of caveats like the one that you are describing, and this is part of how we develop these methodologies, to be very explicit about them.
There are caveats from both sides, right? I mean, you talk a lot about the data, meaning the data don't provide you with finding the conclusions you actually want to find, a given, and that's clear. But also the model, right? It's always an abstraction of reality. So you try to model all different kinds of factors. But then again, if you don't consider either confounding factors or something you just don't know yet, then it's incomplete as well. So the process itself of building a model will never be complete in this sense anyway.
Let me add something to this. there is something more, even more fundamental, that little point that I said at the optimum compression. Not only we don't know this, but this value is unknowable. It's impossible to have a process, an algorithm that tells you what that value is. For those of you that are interested, it's called Kolmogorov complexity, and it's an uncomputable value. So it is good and bad news. It's bad. It's bad news because machine learning is not going to do the whole job. It's just impossible. It's not going to happen. But the good news is that you're going to have jobs for eternity.
And good excuses.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed postdocs very much. I come from a background of systems engineering, and so I have a bit of a fundamental question. So the line of reasoning and research is very sound and very rich in the literature. What I'm trying to focus on now is that exactly what you said at the moment, with over-engineering these models and overfitting the models. One way is to come up with these models. Another way that is currently going up, actually gaining attraction, is to have a systems engineering principle into these models of not having a big model that describes all of these fashions, rather have these specialized models that are connecting together, and then having accurate enough model that can predict the system, can actually go with the cascade of these models together to actually go about black boxing basically, and getting a more explanation of the whole situation or whole system, bigger system. What would you see that this is like a combination of these two to come up with these models? Is for each one of these is accurate enough, or go about a bigger network of systems basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, as I was saying, it's not realistically, except in some rare instances, you never really have models for real-world observations which are tiny and fit in the palm of your hand, like these little equations that I showed. It's always a little bit more than that. The question is how much complexity do we need? And what you often see is that, for example, there is a certain kind of meta-induction that you often see being very successful with, where, I couldn't go into this, but usually it's like you come up with a model, and then whenever you come up with a model, you have to make some assumptions, right? Or put in statistical terms, you have to come up with priors for what you're going to observe, and then realize, well, maybe I shouldn't have thought of this prior, but because you don't know this. So what you do is you put up a model for your prior, and then which has its own hyperparameters than a model. So by following this path, you end up with modularized systems like the one you're describing. It turns out to be a very effective way of detecting the correct amount of complexity. You build these hierarchical systems that are able to essentially understand patterns at different levels of granularity. And then the upper layers, they tend to find the coarser patterns. That's actually how these neural networks tend to work as well. So these concepts that you're, in a vague sense, that you're mentioning, end up appearing as a consequence when you turn the crank of, trying to find the most compressed system. Yeah.
It's a bit of a different take to the question, because a model could be a statistical model, could also be a machine learning model, right? So this systemic approach to that is currently happening, and this was also my last slide, the agentic AI part, right? Call it agentic AI in the agent that combines small models, or call it ensemble learning if you want to have, like, let's say, very small models as opposed to large models that are currently en vogue. They do a lot for us, obviously. Not sure whether they will sustain, whether large multimodal models will be the thing to be on a transformer basis in 5 years. I'm not sure. Probably what I would hope for is, and that's our drive as well, obviously, is that we have very small specialized models that do the trick very well. And then you have to have something, which could be an agent, which could be some kind of hierarchical, I don't know, middleware, call it, layer, that really understands a question, perhaps natural language-based interaction. You ask a question, and the agent in between, first of all, pulls together the models it needs for answering this question, and perhaps even takes decisions and goes one step further as well in terms of like what the understanding that is generated through the machine learning model actually means.
So all problems solved.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your presentations. They were very interesting. I wanted to draw from the beginning of your presentation, Tiago, and the examples that you use and the little comments about the smartness of the birds and the slime mold. And I really got caught in this silly joke, right? Or like this idea, because I thought it was very interesting how you presented that maybe just by the simplification of explaining the rules they were following, that would mean that they are not as smart. But the next following example was actually the correlation between our own patterns that we've developed in roads, right? Actually, it's quite impressive that a slime mold can do it. And I was wondering, what are your insights of the simplifications of these processes in a summary of really, really simple rules connected to the idea of intelligence, especially in the moment that we are currently living in, where intelligence, especially non-human, is being so debated?
Thank you for this question. I didn't want to disparage the little birds. I was just making indeed a joke. It's like, it's kind of, you know, these things are, these are highly successful organisms. That's not, from an evolutionary perspective, there's nothing to joke about. In fact, for example, think of anthills, right? Ants. You know, they are also, it's a kind of a complex system. You can, if you look at individual ants, they are not doing something very more complex than the birds, but they're not doing something terribly complicated, but they end up with a system that's very robust, very capable. So if you could talk about, so intelligence is something that's ill-defined, but I think you could talk about the intelligence of ants at what they do. And at what they do, they're much better than any human will ever be, right? So I think it would be disparaging to say these are dumb animals. It's not my intention. My intention so that this is not something terribly elaborate, but the whole, like, no, I was expecting this question never came. Why do the birds do that? Like, why did they evolve to behave like that? It's an interesting question. It's not answered by finding out the rules. This just explains the mechanism by which this emerges, but doesn't explain why they do that. And it has to do with intelligence, right? They do that because but just by behaving like a big cloud, for some predators, they look like a big object. And then they don't attack. And there are other questions too. For example, why do the individual birds or fishes, they also act individualistically? Because if you're on your own, floating around, you're obvious prey. But if they go together with the others individually, even though the whole thing maybe is even a bigger target, could be from a different kind of animal, that individual bird is protected, right? We're going to have a talk about game theory, right? And this kind of thing will be I think, mentioned, right? It's a strategy, right? But there's lots going on here, and there's, I think, you can see them from the point of view of intelligence, for sure, right? So I completely agree with your point.
I actually appreciated a lot that the last example was based on human.
Yeah.
And how that kind of went on to show that this simplification of neural patterns just go beyond.
Yeah, we can say that humans are dumb, right? It's fine. So in fact, yeah, but I should have mentioned. I'm sorry, it was a missed opportunity. So now that occurs, see, I'm not even that. But yeah, not as smart as the slime mode. Maybe the slime mode have made the joke, yes. But I mean, many things are like, for example, polarization or centralization. So, for example, people were, you know, I was one of the people who were, before Elon Musk came and so on, I was saying, but this is a bad idea to have something like Twitter because everything's centralized. And then somebody can come and buy it, and then it happened. But then if you look at this decentralized services, if you look at the distribution of the sizes, you have one big one, and then the rest small ones. So you have this emergent centralization that happens by itself. Nobody's trying to make it centralized, but it happens like that by itself. I think things like polarization, for example, online polarization, has elements like that. It's not the whole of it, but a lot of what happens is self-organized in this way. So humans are not, they're also behaving like ants to some degree, right, in that sense. So I think I like very much your point. I think it's just right.
And I agree with you that sometimes it can, having these machine learning things that makes you wonder what kind of, how intelligent is our intelligence, right? So kind of a redefinition of what's going on up there. So, well, let's close the question session or the panel here today. So we learned that complex systems can be applied, the methods, to a lot of different aspects, and we learned that AI can save lives. So thank you very much.